Did Jesus rise from the dead, or was the whole story just made up? That's what we'll be looking at today. We have already seen that Jesus is a historical person in a previous video. Feel free to watch this video first. But did he really rise from the dead? If he didn't, then the whole Christian faith is false. The first proof are the precautions the Romans took. They overheard rumors that the disciples were coming to steal his body and then claim he had risen. The Romans put guards in front of the tomb. It is assumed that there were about 10 to 30 guards. They were very well trained because they had an important job. They had to protect the tomb with their lives. If these soldiers had fallen asleep or failed in their duty, they would have faced death. And even then, they would all have to fall asleep at the same time. The second measure is that the Romans placed a stone in front of the opening of the tomb and additionally sealed it. This stone weighed around 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. The disciples of Jesus, who were simple people such as fishermen, would therefore have had to break into the tomb past the Roman soldiers. Is this a realistic scenario? Definitely not. Another point is that the disciples were very frightened after the crucifixion of Jesus. But after the resurrection, this fear was completely gone and the disciples were prepared to die for their faith. Here are 10 examples of this. 1. Simon Peter. Death, crucifixion in Rome, ca 64 to 67 AD. Details: according to tradition, he asked to be crucified upside down because he did not feel worthy to die like Jesus. 2. James the Elder, son of Zebedee. Death, beheading, ca 44 AD. Details: was beheaded in Jerusalem on the orders of King Herod Agrippa I, the first of the apostles to be killed. 3. Andrew, brother of Peter. Death, crucified, ca 60 AD. Details: according to tradition, died on an X-shaped cross, St. Andrew's Cross, in Greece. 4. Philip. Death, crucified or stoned to death, ca 80 AD. Details: possibly crucified or stoned to death in Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey. 5. Bartholomew, Nathaniel. Death, flayed and beheaded, ca 70 AD. Details: cruelly killed in Armenia or India. 6. Thomas, the Doubter. Death, killed by a spear, ca 72 AD. Details: said to have proselytized in India and died there by being stabbed with a spear. 7. Matthew, Levi. Death, stabbed or stoned to death, ca 60 to 70 AD. Details: probably murdered in Ethiopia or Persia. 8. James the Younger, son of Alphaeus. Death, thrown from the temple and beaten to death with a club, ca 62 AD. Details: allegedly killed by Pharisees in Jerusalem. 9. Thaddeus, Judas, not Iscariot. Death, slain with a club or killed with arrows, c. 65 to 80 AD. Details: believed to have been killed in Persia or Syria. 10. Simon the Zealot. Death, crucified or cut with a saw, c. 65 AD. Details: possibly died in Persia or Britain. This is not only claimed by Christian sources. The most important historical sources for the martyrdom of Peter and Paul come from early Christian writings. Clement of Rome, 96 AD, mentions in his letter to the Corinthians that both were killed in Rome under Emperor Nero. Eusebius of Caesarea and Origen report that Peter was crucified, according to later tradition upside down, and Paul was beheaded as a Roman citizen. The reason I'm telling you this is because these people hardly died for a lie. They went to their deaths because they were 100% sure that Jesus had risen and that they were following the truth. Another point is that Jesus showed himself after the resurrection. Acts 1 verse 3 says, after his passion he showed them by many proofs that he was alive, for 40 days he appeared to them, speaking of the kingdom of God. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 it says the following, afterward he was seen by more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still alive today, but some have fallen asleep. These 500 people saw Jesus after the resurrection. Amazing, isn't it? These 500 people can't have had a hallucination at the same time. That would be an even greater miracle than the resurrection itself. Another important detail is that Paul mentions here that some of these witnesses are still alive. Why does he do this? To make it clear that the person reading this text can simply ask these eyewitnesses if they do not believe him. Furthermore, the resurrection is not only confirmed by the Bible. There are also extra-biblical writings that confirm it, for example Josephus Jewish Antiquities 18.3.3 or Thomas Arnold, History of Rome. We know that these two historians were not Christians. There are also current historians, for example Frank Morrison, Lee Strobel, or Josh McDowell. They wanted to prove that Jesus was not resurrected, but became Christians during their research because they realized that everything speaks for the resurrection. Read their books on the subject. The next point is that the body of Jesus was never found. If the Romans had had the body, they could have simply shown it and thus disproved the resurrection, but they did not. That alone is good proof that he was resurrected. There is also no evidence that Jesus was not placed in the tomb. The fact that only women found the empty tomb also speaks against a lie. Women were not accepted as witnesses in Israel at the time, and it would be foolish to make up a story in which women of all people are witnesses to the empty tomb. There is another theory that Jesus was not dead at all. But is this realistic? No. Jesus was severely whipped before the crucifixion. The flesh, muscles, and nerves on his back were shredded. He already collapsed while carrying the cross. He could have survived up to this point. In order not to suffocate on the cross, Jesus had to push up his chest with his hands and feet. The soldiers knew exactly when he was dead. They were professional killers and very good at their job. If a prisoner had escaped, they would have been executed themselves. When the soldiers put a spear between Jesus' ribs and water and blood came out. This is a sign that he must have been dead by that time. The oozing of blood and water from Jesus' side is described in John 19 verse 34. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. This description strongly suggests that Jesus was already dead. From a medical point of view, there are two possible explanations. Pericardial tamponade. If Jesus died from crucifixion shock or suffocation, fluid, serous water, could have accumulated in the pericardium. The lance thrust would then have released both this clear fluid and blood from the heart or lungs. Pulmonary edema. In severe shock or respiratory distress, typical in crucifixion, fluid may accumulate in the lungs. A stab wound to the chest would then have released a mixture of blood and tissue fluid. Why is this important? The Romans were experts in executions. They would not have taken Jesus off the cross alive. The lance thrust was probably a test to see if Jesus was really dead. The conversion of skeptics also speaks for the resurrection. James, the brother of Jesus, did not originally believe in him, John 7 verse 5, but became a leading Christian after the resurrection, Acts 15. Paul was a persecutor of Christians and radically changed his life after he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, Acts 9. The early proclamation of the resurrection also speaks in favor of the resurrection. The resurrection was preached very early, not after decades, but immediately after Jesus' death. Corinthians 15 contains a tradition that goes back to the first years after the crucifixion. If the resurrection were a legend, it would have taken longer to develop. Christianity spread despite intense persecution. If the resurrection had been a lie, it would be difficult to explain why so many people were prepared to sacrifice their lives for it. Besides, there is no alternative explanation that really makes sense of what happened there. If it was a lie, there would have to be one. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss anything.